Sandra Hemme's story has become the subject of several recent news reports. Sandra is the woman who had the longest prison sentence for a wrongful conviction in the entire United States. In all, she spent more than 43 years in prison for a crime she didn't commit. Sandra didn't know the victim. There was no proof or physical evidence linking her to the crime, but she was still arrested and convicted. But how did this happen? In this video, I'll tell you in detail how Sandra Hemme ended up arrested and spent more than 4 decades in jail. To better understand the Sandra Hemme case, we first need to understand the case of Patricia Jeschke, who is also a central figure in this story. On the morning of November 13, 1980, Patricia Jeschke, a 31-year-old secretary, didn't show up for work at the St. Joseph City Library. St. Joseph is a city located in the state of Missouri in the United States that today has an estimated population of 72,000 inhabitants. As Patricia didn't show up for her work at the library, Dorothy Elliott, the director of the place, was worried. Patricia didn't usually miss work, and if that had been the case, she would certainly have given advance notice. Dorothy called Patricia several times, but none of her calls were answered. This made her worry more and more, so she decided to go to the woman's house. When she arrived at the house, Dorothy saw Patricia's car parked in front, but found the house completely locked. She knocked on the door and called several times, but there was no answer either. Dorothy then called Patricia's mother, Helen McLaughlin. On the phone, Dorothy explained the whole situation to Helen and said she was worried because she hadn't been able to speak to Patricia. Helen quickly went to her daughter's house, and when she saw that the house was locked and her daughter wasn't answering, she decided, with Dorothy's help, to break a window to get inside. It was around 1 p.m., and when the two managed to get into the house, they found Patricia's naked body next to the bed. Helen was shocked by what she saw, while Dorothy, despite being very shaken, managed to call the police. When the police arrived, they saw that Patricia had a wound on the back of her head and that there was a telephone wire around her neck. The police also found that there were no signs of a break-in or forced entry. This indicated that either the criminal was an acquaintance of the victim and had access to the place, or the victim was surprised while opening the door of the house. An investigation was carried out at the house, and it was discovered that a struggle had taken place there, indicating that Patricia had fought for her life. Patricia's handbag was missing, and the police searched the whole house but couldn't find it. In the house, the police found a strand of hair that didn't belong to the victim. After the forensic investigation, Patricia's body was taken for an autopsy, which found that she had been the victim of forced intercourse and had suffered several wounds to the head and punctures to her body made with a bladed object, probably a knife. The cause of death was due to the victim being suffocated with the telephone wire, but if she hadn't been suffocated, she would have died from bleeding due to the punctures in her body. The autopsy also found that Patricia had been lifeless for around 14 hours. Lloyd Pasley, a police officer at the time, was put in charge of the investigation, and a reward of $1,000 was offered by Patricia's parents to anyone with information about the crime. In total, the police checked more than 200 clues relating to the case. When they spoke to neighbors, they said they didn't hear any strange noises coming from Patricia's house. The only thing they saw was that on the day of the murder, there was a white pickup truck parked in front of the victim's house. The police asked them if they knew the license plate number of the truck, but they said they didn't. Shortly afterwards, the theory was raised that the crime that killed Patricia was connected to the case of Roger Atkinson and Rose Burkert. In short, Roger Atkinson and Rose Burkert were a couple of lovers who were the victims of a brutal crime. This crime took place on a Friday night, September 12, 1980. Roger and Rose were staying at the Amana Holiday Inn and were surprised by someone with an axe while they were asleep. The room they were in became a real horror movie set, and many police officers working on the case at the time said that what they saw in the room was the most horrific thing of their lives. The crime took place in the town of Williamsburg in the state of Iowa. And to this day, despite numerous theories, the identity of the person responsible for this crime remains unknown. Now, regarding the possible connection between Patricia's case and the case of Roger and Rose, The authorities have said that there is no evidence linking the two cases. Almost a month later, on December 5, 1980, the police arrested Joseph Patrick Wabski and Sandra Lynn Hemme. Joseph was accused of being the perpetrator of the crime, while Sandra was accused of being an accomplice and of concealing knowledge of the crime. At the time, Sandra was 20 years old and had been struggling with mental illness. She was undergoing treatment in a psychiatric hospital after having used drugs, something that had aggravated her mental condition. Sandra had a very troubled life from a very young age. When she was just 13, she tried to take her own life and spent 6 years in mental institutions. In the meantime, she tried to take her own life 4 more times. She also got into a relationship and had a daughter. According to sources, Sandra met Joseph in one of the mental institutions where she was interned. On November 25, 1980, a few days before her arrest, Sandra got into a scuffle with the police after threatening a policeman with a knife. At the time, she was arrested but did not remain in custody for long. It's not known for sure how it happened, at least I couldn't find it in the sources. But during the period when Sandra was arrested and then released before being arrested again, she talked to some detectives and gave them information about the crime against Patricia Jeschke. Sandra told detectives that on November 12th, the day before the murder, she hitchhiked with 2 people named Joe and Pat. Pat was Patricia Jeschke, and Joe was Joseph Patrick Wabski. According to Sandra, in the middle of this ride, Joseph took Patricia to her house and got in with her, while Sandra stayed in the car waiting. Sandra said that sometime later, Joseph left the house and returned to the car with his hands full of blood. Joseph would have looked at Sandra and said, "I finished with that bitch." And then he threatened Sandra by saying that if she told anyone about it, he would finish her off too. Upon hearing this, the detectives decided to check further to see if the story was true. They then decided to go after Joseph Wabski, the man allegedly responsible for the crime. In the meantime, Sandra had been released by the police and was interspersed between the psychiatric hospital and wandering the streets of the city. On December 5, 1980, as already mentioned, Sandra Hemme and Joseph Wabski were arrested. From then on, things get a bit confusing, and a series of factors contribute to Sandra Hemme being arrested and convicted of a crime she didn't commit. Soon after Sandra and Joseph were arrested, the detectives decided to take Sandra to the neighborhood where Patricia's house was located. According to the detectives, Sandra pointed to the correct house and gave details of the crime. However, her lawyer disputed the detectives' claim at the time and said that Sandra was forced into it and in fact had little idea of where Patricia lived. Joseph Wabski, on the other hand, denied the crime and said he didn't know the victim. He admitted that he knew Sandra, saying that he met her while she was undergoing treatment in a ward for drug addicts in a psychiatric hospital, but denied that he gave her a lift on November 12th. This didn't convince the police. Joseph Wabski had a long criminal record, including one for assaulting police officers in 1977. At the time of the crime, he had been living in a halfway house for a few months. Detectives questioned Joseph about where he was on November 12th, since he claimed not to have given Sandra a ride and not to have committed the crime. Joseph said he was working in Topeka in the state of Kansas, and that there were witnesses who could prove his alibi. When the police went to Topeka, 3 witnesses and business records proved that Joseph was indeed working there when the crime took place. Another thing was that Joseph's vehicle didn't match the description given by Patricia's neighbors. Joseph has never owned a white truck. As a result, Joseph was released, and because of all the trouble he had been through, he said he was going to sue the police. Sandra Hemme, meanwhile, remained in prison. She even changed her version, saying that on the day of the murder, she entered the house together with Joseph and Patricia, whereas before she said she had been waiting in the car. In this new version, Sandra said that she witnessed the whole crime and that she even tried to prevent it, but because Joseph was much stronger than her, she couldn't do it. By now, the police no longer believed Sandra's words, and since Joseph had a good alibi and had already been released, all the blame for the crime fell on her. In the days that followed, Sandra was questioned intensively. She gave numerous conflicting versions. Her already messed up mind became even worse, and she finally confessed to the crime. On December 10th, Sandra Hemme was formally charged with the crime against Patricia Jeschke. Even though the authorities had no physical evidence linking Sandra to the crime, they decided to keep her in custody because of her statements. Sandra's boyfriend at the time even testified on her behalf. He told detectives that on the day of the murder, he picked Sandra up from the psychiatric hospital, spent some time with her, then took her to her parents' house, and the next day picked her up and took her back to the hospital. That being the case, there's no way Sandra could have been responsible for the crime. However, Sandra's boyfriend's statement was of no use to the police, and she remained in prison. On December 18th, Sandra had her preliminary hearing. At the hearing, when asked by the judge in charge what happened on the day of the murder, Sandra, a little confused, says that she took Patricia's life. The judge asked for details of the crime, and Sandra said that she had hit Patricia on the head very hard. The judge asked for more details, while Sandra says she doesn't remember much of what happened because she was a bit doped up. When asked how she knew Patricia and how she ended up at the victim's house, Sandra said she wasn't sure and that perhaps Patricia had given her a lift. Seeing that Sandra's statements were confusing, the judge thought it best to recess the hearing for a few minutes. The recess lasted about 20 minutes, and when the hearing resumed, the judge asked Sandra if her memory was better. Sandra answered yes, and then the judge questioned her again about how she met Patricia. Sandra said that Patricia had offered her a ride to Kansas City while she was wandering the streets. Kansas City was the city where Sandra's parents lived at the time. According to Sandra, the two passed a food store and then went to Patricia's house. Sandra said that when she got home, Patricia put some food on the table and then said she was going to the bathroom. When Patricia returned, Sandra attacked her. The judge asked why Sandra attacked Patricia since she had just met her, and Sandra said it was because of a disagreement involving drugs. Patricia's father, Earl McLaughlin, who was present at the hearing, disputed this and said that his daughter had never used drugs. Sandra finished her statement by saying that she attacked Patricia with a hunting knife and even used the telephone cord to suffocate her. This was completely in line with what was found at the crime scene, but obviously Sandra knew all this because she had spent several hours talking to the detectives, who even showed her several photos of the crime scene. Furthermore, according to some sources, during the recession, Sandra's own lawyer, Dale Sullivan, told her to mention the telephone wire so that the story would be more acceptable. At the end of the hearing, Sandra pleaded guilty to the crime and the judge agreed. She did this as part of a deal to avoid going to trial with the risk of being sentenced to capital punishment. Sandra Hemme was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 50 years. At Christmas, Sandra wrote a letter to her mother saying that she thought she was innocent, but that at the same time she might be guilty. She said she was ill and wished she were no longer alive. In the same letter, she asked her mother to take care of her daughter. The truth was that apart from Sandra's conflicting confession, the authorities had nothing physical on her. Even when she was questioned by detectives about Patricia's purse and the knife she used in the crime, she said she had thrown the knife in a field in the city of Lexington, and the purse she said she threw on Interstate 70. However, when she took the police to the places she mentioned, nothing was found there. In addition to it, Patricia was raped, and it was common knowledge that the person responsible for this was a man. Sandra initially said that it was Joseph Wobski who had done this to Patricia, but as we already know, that was impossible because Joseph was miles away from the crime scene. Sandra was even asked who the man was who took Patricia's life, but she was never able to give a name. Sandra was in prison, the blame for the crime was on her, and the authorities had no idea who the man involved in the case was. Now let's move on to another part of this story, a very important part. In December 1980, a man went to a photography store in Kansas City to buy a camera. One of the employees had seen the man in the store before because in November of that same year, the man had gone there to make a purchase, but the credit card in his possession didn't work. It turned out that the credit card the man tried to use was stolen, and that the card bore the name of Patricia Jeschke. The man tried to use the card on the same day that Patricia was found lifeless. That man is Michael Holman, a 22-year-old patrol officer who worked in the city of St. Joseph in Missouri. In December of that same year, Michael told his police colleagues that they wouldn't believe the story he had to tell them. Michael explained to his colleagues how he had been in possession of Patricia Jeschke's card for a while. Michael's colleagues obviously found the whole story strange and decided to inform their superiors. On the same day, the police went to Kansas City to talk to the employees of the photo store mentioned by Michael. The officers showed the staff 5 photos of different people and asked if anyone in the photos was a relative. One of the employees quickly recognized Michael Holman's photo, saying that he had been there twice. The clerk even showed a dated receipt with Michael's name on it. From that point on, the police decided to investigate Michael further to find out what his connection to the crime was. It was discovered that Michael had a white truck that matched the description given by Patricia's neighbors. Michael was called to give evidence, and when asked where he was on the day of the murder, he said that he had spent the night at a motel called Woodland Courts, together with a woman called Mary, who he said was his mistress. Michael asked the police for secrecy because he was married and didn't want other people to know that he had a mistress, because it would soon spread and sooner or later his wife would know. The police then went to look for the woman called Mary, but no Mary was found. Regarding Patricia's credit card, Michael claimed that he found it on the ground in the parking lot of the motel where he stayed with Mary. He said that he had tried to change Patricia's name to Patrick with a needle and that once he had used the card, he would throw it away. The police asked if that's what he did with the card. If he threw it away, Michael said yes. An important fact is that the Woodland Courts motel was very close to Patricia's house. After giving evidence, Michael was released by the authorities. However, the police were not very convinced by his story, not least because no Mary was found to confirm his alibi. The police then went to the Woodland Courts motel and, in conversation with the staff, discovered that the names Michael or Mary were not listed in the motel's records. A few days later, Michael was called back to testify, and this time, the police asked him to give the number of the room he stayed in at the motel and to describe what the room looked like inside, with details that he would only know if he had actually spent a night there. Michael refused to do this, and it was at this point that the police were sure he was hiding something. As a result, the authorities decided to keep Michael in custody until it was determined whether or not he was connected to the crime. Michael contacted an uncle who was a former policeman, and the uncle contacted a lawyer. In the days that followed, the police focused their investigations on Michael, and by that time, Sandra was already in prison for a crime she hadn't committed. A strand of Michael's hair was collected by the authorities so that a comparison could be made with the strand found at the crime scene. Michael's hair had microscopic characteristics similar to the hair found at the crime scene, but that alone wasn't enough to say he was guilty. In a search of Michael's house, the police found some women's belts that were stored as if they were hidden. The police showed the belts to Michael's wife, asking her if they belonged to her. The woman looked surprised and said that they weren't hers and that she had never seen them before. The police then decided to contact Patricia's father, and when they showed him the belts, the man said that they belonged to his daughter and that he had given them to her as a present. There was plenty of evidence to place Michael Holman as the perpetrator of the crime, but instead Michael was only charged with robbery. In his statements, Michael denied committing the crime and said that he had only taken advantage of it to steal some of the victim's belongings. As the authorities had already arrested Sandra Hemme for the crime, it seems that the police didn't want to make much effort to prove that Michael was the real culprit. Of all the detectives working on the case at the time, it seemed that only one believed that Sandra Hemme was innocent, with Michael Holman being the real culprit. That detective is Lloyd Pasley, the same detective who was in charge of the investigations as soon as they began. For Lloyd, Sandra didn't know Patricia and only said things about the crime as if she were guilty because of her mental problems. In short, Sandra was in the right place at the right time for someone who wanted to find a culprit and close the case. Despite leading the initial investigations and being certain that Sandra wasn't guilty of the crime, Lloyd couldn't do much, since the general consensus was that the woman had committed the crime, and she had even confessed to it. Michael Holman spent a year in prison for stealing Patricia's belongings and was later released. Now, before we go any further, I need to talk about the Mickey Joe West case, which is a case that in a way is linked to the Sandra Hemme case. On September 11, 1979, Mickey Jo West, 19 years old at the time, left her home in the morning to go to work. Mickey worked as a nursing assistant in a psychiatric hospital in the city of St. Joseph. Some people later told the police that they saw Mickey walking towards the bus stop, which was 4 blocks away from her house. That was the last time anyone saw the woman. Upon noticing Mickey's absence, her co-workers tried to contact her but were unsuccessful. They then contacted the woman's relatives who, after failing to locate her anywhere, went to the authorities and reported her missing. In the months that followed, the police investigations came to nothing. Mickey's parents even offered a reward of $10,000 for any information leading to her whereabouts, but nothing came of it. It was then, after Sandra Hemme's arrest, that some police officers began to theorize that perhaps Sandra had some connection to this case. It should be remembered that Mickey worked as a nursing assistant at St. Joseph's Psychiatric Hospital, the same hospital where Sandra was being treated. For the police, there was a good chance that Sandra knew Mickey and was responsible for whatever happened to her. Based on this theory, some police officers went to talk to Sandra. The police asked her if she knew Mickey, and Sandra said she did. Then they asked her if she knew what had happened to the woman, and Sandra said she did. The police then asked for more details, and Sandra told them that Mickey was part of some kind of cult and that other cult members had taken her life. Sandra also said that all of Mickey's internal organs were removed and she was then buried in a rural area of the city of St. Joseph. Sandra gave the police the location of where Mickey's body was supposedly. However, after searching the entire area mentioned by Sandra, nothing was found. It's very likely that Sandra really did know Mickey, as Mickey worked at the hospital where Sandra was receiving treatment, but anything beyond that was pure invention in Sandra's mind. Mickey Jo West's case remained unsolved for more than a decade, until in 1991, Marvin Lee Irvin confessed that he had kidnapped her and then taken her life. Marvin is an ex-cop, serial killer, and also Mickey's ex-brother-in-law. After confessing to the crime, he said that Mickey's body was buried in a cornfield in the state of Kansas. The police went to the location given by Marvin, but came back empty-handed. Marvin also confessed to taking the lives of 2 other women, Patricia Rose and Crystal Simmons. He is currently incarcerated at the Jefferson City Correctional Center in the state of Missouri, where he is serving his life sentence without the possibility of parole. That was a brief summary of Mickey Jo West's case to give us a better context for Sandra's case. Now, continuing with Sandra Hemme's case, in November 1982, she recanted her confession and filed a motion to have her sentence overturned. She said that she had confessed to the crime in a moment of weakness and that her lawyer had deceived her. According to Sandra, her lawyer said that she would only serve 9 to 13 years in prison, and that the 50 years that had been publicized was really just to make Patricia's family happy. Furthermore, Sandra was not informed that she could ask for a mental examination to prove her problems. The following year, 1983, the Buchanan County Court rejected Sandra's motion, but the following year, 1984, the Missouri Court of Appeals overturned her conviction. As a result, a new trial was scheduled. This retrial took place in June 1985 and lasted just 1 day. Again, no evidence was presented that Sandra had committed the crime, apart from her initial confession that she had already recanted. Even so, after 3.5 hours of deliberation, Sandra Hemme was convicted again. 3 weeks later, Sandra filed a motion for a new trial, but it was denied. Several pieces of evidence were hidden from Sandra's defense by the prosecution. Among this evidence was an FBI report that eliminated any connection between Sandra Hemme and the crime scene. There was also evidence of Michael Holman's connection to the case. Everything indicated that the prosecution was doing everything it could to keep Sandra locked up, even though there was no evidence against her. All the evidence points to Michael Holman as the person responsible for the crime against Patricia Jeschke, but according to some sources, there was a cover-up by some police officers who helped Michael get away with it. Michael was even arrested on charges of theft because he had some items that belonged to Patricia, but he only spent a year in prison and was later released. After that, the only information I found about him was that he moved from St. Joseph and passed away in 2015. After having her second motion rejected in 1985, Sandra remained imprisoned and hopeless. With each passing day, she believed less and less that one day she could be freed and return to her family. Speaking of family, Sandra's family always stayed by her side and were always in touch. She didn't see her daughter grow up, but through letters and phone calls, she communicated and kept up with what she could about her daughter. This family support is what gave Sandra the strength to live and to believe that one day she could be freed and return to live alongside those she loves. In February 2023, the Innocence Project filed a petition to free Sandra Hemme from prison. They claim that Sandra confessed to the crime without having the slightest idea of what she was doing, and that all the evidence points to Michael Holman as the sole perpetrator. Larry Harmon, a lawyer who worked on Sandra's case, said that the authorities took advantage of her fragile mental health. In addition, Detective Lloyd Pasley, responsible for the initial investigations into Patricia's case, said that Michael Holman claimed that his service weapon had been stolen. However, it was discovered that the weapon had actually been taken for cleaning and then returned for service. Lloyd Pasley theorized that Michael used his gun to strike Patricia in the head, but as the gun was cleaned by professionals, any traces of the crime that were on it were gone. It should be remembered that all this evidence was withheld from Sandra Hemme's defense so that she remained in prison. Following the petition filed by the Innocence Project, an evidentiary hearing for Sandra Hemme was scheduled. This hearing only took place on January 16, 2024, and lasted 3 days. In June 2024, Judge Ryan Horsman, in a 118-page memorandum, ruled that the evidence linked Michael Holman directly to the crime, while there was no evidence linking Sandra Hemme to the case. The judge also stated that Sandra's first lawyer was ineffective. Buchanan County prosecutors were given 30 days to give Sandra a new trial or dismiss the charges against her. There was a stalemate over this. The prosecution didn't want to give Sandra a new trial, let alone dismiss the charges against her. The judge then gave them an ultimatum and said that if Sandra wasn't released within the set time limit, the prosecutor in charge would be summoned to court. Then, on July 19, 2024, after spending more than 43 years in prison for a crime she didn't commit, Sandra Hemme was released. She was met by her sister, daughter, and granddaughter, who were waiting for her in front of the prison. Sandra didn't want to talk to the press because the first thing she wanted to do was visit her father, who was very ill in hospital. Sandra Hemme is the woman who had the longest prison sentence for a wrongful conviction in the entire United States. I haven't found information on whether she will file a lawsuit against the Missouri authorities, but it's very likely that she will. In any case, I'll post any news about this case here on my YouTube community.